back to another video, and today we're finally doing the Dino Dex accuracy review, which I do want to mention that I will be doing a review of the actual series at some point, but right now I'm just going to be doing the accuracy review. But anyways, let's jump into this video. So, the first creature that we're going to be covering is Sarcosuchus, which is a creature that I was not quite expecting, but anyways, let's jump into this. So first off, the head shape is just generally kind of incorrect. It's way too narrow and more gharial-like, opposed to Sarcosuchus still having a narrow skull compared to other prehistoric croc relatives, somewhat, which we'll get into that more in a second. But it still had a much beefier, kind of wider skull compared to this one, alongside just generally the snout being shorter and the nasal boss being larger. Next, let's move on to just the general look of the body. Generally, the body's not horrible. It is very thin. It needs to be bulked out again, kind of like the head. But also, it should have more enlarged kind of osteoderms on its back, though there may be a reason why they're not as big on this model, but again, we'll get to that in a moment. Looking at the feet seem to have the right amount of digits, having 5 fingers on the front and 4 toes on the back foot. Now, looking at the size, Sarcosuchus could grow between 30 to 40 feet, though 40 feet is a much larger estimate, though I believe more modern estimates are closer to 30 right now. But anyways, the one in the show is shown to be closer to 15 feet roughly, which that's probably because the one in the show is actually a juvenile Sarcosuchus and not an adult Sarcosuchus. Though, yeah, but so we can just ignore the size for now. Now, the fact that in the show they do mention that, well, Sarcosuchus, if its tail got ripped off, it would be able to grow it back. Which, here's the thing about that. I mean, I don't think it's impossible, since modern crocodilians are able to grow their tails back if they get ripped off. Though, the thing is, Sarcosuchus technically is not a crocodilian. It is basically part of a group that is closely related to crocodilians, but it's not a true crocodilian itself. So, I mean, a little bit more of a stretch for Sarcosuchus, but I do think it's still somewhat reasonable. Now, the thing that pretty much everyone has probably noticed by now, these giant spines, there's really no reason for them to be here. Honestly, the only excuse I can think of why they maybe put this on was maybe they just thought the design was missing something, and also due to the fact that Sarcosuchus was incapable of doing a death roll, maybe they thought it was reasonable enough to have a structure on its back, but yeah, it's really unreasonable, and honestly would probably hinder the creature in ambushing anything. So, yeah, generally, I do have to say that I think that Sarcosuchus probably should have been replaced with a actual prehistoric crocodilian, Gryphosuchus, which Gryphosuchus is a true crocodilian, it's closely related to gharials, and generally, if it wasn't Gryphosuchus, this design would be pretty much perfect minus the spines. But since it's a Sarcosuchus, I instead have to give it a 6 stars. It's a pretty okay model, but it doesn't quite resemble a Sarcosuchus. Also, it does have quite a few inaccuracies. So, yeah, moving on to the next one, which is Ankylosaurus. First off, the Ankylosaurus' skull shape is pretty close. It actually looks pretty good. Though, I don't know about the the armor ending at the end of the beak and then turning into more of like some skin with a beak. Instead, I usually see Ankylosaurus with the armor extending all the way down to the end of the face and kind of fusing with the beak, which you can also see that in its actual skull. So another issue with the Ankylosaurus besides that is that it has way too big of eyes. It's kind of cartoony eyes, though they could be a little bit smaller. Moving on, the armor looks pretty solid actually. Generally, the armor may be a little bit too raised, but besides that, the Ankylosaurus' armor layout looks pretty good. Though I do want to also touch on the fact that the club shape is a little bit too broad at the base of it, while in reality it should be a little bit more slender, but otherwise the club is not too bad. Another issue with the Ankylosaurus is it's a bit too flexible, generally in the whole body, which is a recurring issue with Ankylosaurs in this series, but also the tail. Honestly, their tails really could only go side to side, and they were stiffened, really, just to be able to bring them so much power. So it being able to bend its tail over its entire body is very unreasonable. And based off the size, the Ankylosaurus looks about the right size, honestly, for an Ankylosaurus. So, yeah, Ankylosaurus, I have to give this one a 7.5 stars. Just really, it's really good Ankylosaurus design. Generally, there's some minor issues with it, but besides that, it's pretty much perfect. Now, we move on to Shuvuuia. So, first off, the general look of this animal is pretty much perfect. The tail might be a little bit too short, but really not too much. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure this model is pretty much perfect. One thing I do want to mention is that it's shown as a carnivore, which, technically is true, but they would have been more of an insectivore, most likely. which is a shame that they never show it eating any insects, though. The beaver, it only appears in one episode, and maybe in other episodes since the whole series is not released. It will feed on insects. So, yeah, generally, Shuvuuia is pretty good. It's a 10 out of 10 species. It's pretty much perfect to the actual animal. They give it some display structures on the head, but there's no quite evidence for them, but they're pretty much very reasonable for the animal. And the feathers look pretty good. They give him the right type of feathers for the type of animal it is, and yeah, pretty perfect. One of, if not the best creatures in the show. Now we move on to Dreadnoughtus. Dreadnoughtus is a questionable species. We'll get into that in a second. But starting with the head, I believe we don't actually have a skull for Dreadnoughtus itself. But based off skulls from other Tyrannosaurs, the head seems a little bit too long. When in reality, it should be a little bit taller. So yeah, another issue is that it has the nostrils on the top of its head, like sauropods have been depicted for a while. While in reality, they would have been at the end of the snout, like most other animals. Next, we have the display structure on the underside of its neck, which there's no evidence for it, though I don't see it being too unrealistic. I mean, it's reasonable enough. I mean, it doesn't seem too big like it would be weighing down the animal's neck, so I think that's pretty reasonable. It is also shown that if Dreadnoughtus lost its tail, it would probably not be able to balance. That's right, alongside most other dinosaurs would not be able to balance without their tails, so that's one reason why they probably would not have been able to drop their tail. Okay, now looking at the size, I don't know why in the show Dreadnoughtus looks a little bit undersized, but I think for the most part it's about the right size. So yeah, Dreadnoughtus size-wise is pretty decent. Now, if we move on to the posture, the issue with the sauropods in this series, they really always have to fit in the frame, and usually they're so tall that if they want to interact with any other creature, they have to have them slouch over. But from the scenes where we actually have a more natural standing up posture, generally I think the front side of the animal should be tilted upwards a little bit more, and also there should be more of a smooth transition through the from the neck to the body. But besides that, the posture is not bad, though the tail, I believe, is a little bit too thick and long. Though, yeah, I think those are the main issues for Dreadnoughtus, at least posture-wise. Now, if we move on to the feet, there's a big issue with the forelimbs. They give them just elephant feet, while in reality, sauropods will have more column-like feet with pretty much just one claw on the inside. And then the hind feet are also incorrect, also being elephant-like, when they should have turtle-like feet with their claws curving outwards. Now we move on to the skin. Generally, sauropods probably had scales covering most of their body and kind of smaller scales with some larger ones every once in a while. They probably also had, most Tyrannosaurs specifically, probably had some armored kind of osteoderm-like spines on its back, which Dreadnoughtus seems to lack. Generally, Dreadnoughtus, I have to give it a 5 stars. Generally, it has all the components, just the proportioning is pretty decent, and they have generally all the pieces, just then the actual skin and in general other like minor details are really messed up. So it's not the best Dreadnoughtus. It's an okay general sauropod, but even then it has quite a few issues. Moving on to the next one, which is Meganeura. So first off, Meganeura, something interesting is that Meganeura is technically not a true dragonfly, it is a griffinfly, and griffinflies were so big that they would not have been able to beat their wings super fast like you see most modern dragonflies, and they would have flapped their wings more like birds, which was something they got incorrect with the Dino Dex interpretation of this animal, and I believe that it is somewhat fixed in the Dino Dex version, though it's kind of hard to tell. It does seem like they are moving quite fast, though. I still think that it is improved somewhat, at least now. Now moving on, it is also shown to like to perch on Dreadnoughtus. In most modern insects, whenever they like to perch and really fly around large animals, usually to feed off fluids from the animal, which is incorrect since, well, Meganeura would have been an active predator, probably hunting small amphibians, reptiles, and occasionally other small arthropods, which is probably which is unfortunately never shown in this series, though it was shown in Dino Dex to do that. Another thing, it wouldn't make sense to go after large animals and like land on them, especially since it really lived before most large land animals. Based off the size, honestly, I think it's a pretty decently sized. I think at some scenes it looks like it might be a little bit too big, but besides that, I think the Meganeura mostly size-wise looks pretty decent. Now, proportion-wise, I believe the wings are a little bit too short and the body's a little bit too round. The head is also quite a bit bigger than it should be, especially compared to Meganeura fossils, and I think the tail might be a bit short as well. Generally, Meganeura is an okay design. It really only gets 5 stars as well, since it's not the best Meganeura interpretation, it just is kind of a big dragonfly. But anyways, let's move on to the next one, which is going to be a doozy because it's Tsintaosaurus. Okay, starting with the size, there's no good scenes of it standing next to any of the characters, but Tsintaosaurus looks about the right size. I think it's a bit undersized, though I've seen some smaller estimates for the animal, which it matches with a little bit better, but generally I think it is a bit undersized. Now, moving on to the general posture. The issue with the Tsintaosaurus is that it is in the show it is shown to be a facultated biped, while in reality it should be a facultated quadruped, which it does go quadrupedal very shortly, and it really just doesn't seem quite rightly postured. It kind of seems like it's an animal that walks on two legs again and then just kind of crouched down really low, while in reality it should mainly look more comfortable on the ground. And yeah, generally I think that is something that they get wrong, with the back kind of dipping in when it's on two legs, and also the back kind of being a little bit just wrongly shaped. Again, also the legs seem kind of squashed whenever it's like that, while they should be more reasonably straightened out, alongside the limbs just generally being postured very weirdly, and also the head being held at not quite a natural angle. Now for walking on two legs, generally hadrosaurs, when they rear on two legs, they usually are just kind of angling their whole entire body upwards some, while in this show it kind of just leans its front half up while tucking the arms under the chest, which is not the most reasonable, because they kind of do pin their arms back a little bit and under the chest, instead of having them kind of like, I don't really know exactly how to explain it, but it is very weird how they hold their bodies, especially on two legs. Moving on to the hands, they're very wrong. They give them 3 fingers, while in reality we know that hadrosaurs would have had pretty much a mitt, and then they would have had a large nail at the end, which is not what the Tsintaosaurus has in this show, unfortunately. Now we move on to the head, which we're not going to touch that infectious lump on top of its head yet, but we're going to talk about the general face shape. The face shape looks pretty decent, actually. Generally, the only issue I do have to say is that the beak should probably be a little bit larger, since we know that they would have curved down a little bit more. But besides that, the general head shape looks pretty solid. Now we're going to have to move on to the kind of the spine-like structures on its back, which we do know that some hadrosaurs would have had them, so I think it's pretty reasonable to add them on the Tsintaosaurus. Now we're going to be moving on to the biggest issue, which is the weird curly things in the head crest. First thing, these weird antenna-looking things have no reason to be here. There's no animal, at least, well, mammal or reptile that I can see that has any structure like this, since they're very much mobile and the animal is able to move these whenever it's making a facial expression. And they're really ridiculous and have no reason to be here. Alongside the fact that it has these, pretty much the crest is completely ruined. Tsintaosaurus had a more narrow, flattened crest, while it seemed like they gave them inflatable sacks on the sides, which is not impossible for hadrosaurs, but for Tsintaosaurus, it most likely did not have them. Especially not like this. Generally, I believe that the inflatable sacks were based off a older theory back before we knew what Tsintaosaurus' entire crest looked like, and we believed that it's kind of just more of like a narrow, almost horn-like structure. We thought that it had inflatable sacks at the base of it, but that is no longer believed since it had a large crest. Instead, it also had air canals going through the inside of the crest, which from what I can tell did not lead to the outside, which is pretty much what you would need if you needed it to actually have an inflatable structure. But instead, they just pretty much made cartilage grow all around the rest of the crest with an inflatable structure in the middle, which is pretty much impossible. I think they really wanted to use the inflatable crest theory for Tsintaosaurus, but since it no longer looked like that, they had to put a completely new structure on it just for it to work, which is very ridiculous. So, yeah, generally Tsintaosaurus should just... I have an image of the PNSO Tsintaosaurus, and generally this is what it should look like, and it looks pretty much nothing like that. Again, you can see the inflatable bulbs that you can kind of see like on the original design. Well, what we originally thought the animal looked like. And generally, I think Tsintaosaurus should have been, well, some sort of Saurolophine, more specifically, in my opinion, Saurolophus, since it generally has all the features that they want in this animal. And Saurolophus is actually part of the group of hadrosaurs that still is believed to possibly actually have inflatable structures on its face. It also does have a crest, but the inflatable structure would actually has a location to be. Instead of being just slapped on some sort of weird crest thing, it actually has an empty kind of cavity on its face where it actually could have an inflatable structure. Generally, they also could have just redesigned their Edmontosaurus, since it's very outdated, and just used that, since Edmontosaurus is also related to Saurolophus and could have had an inflatable structure on its nasal cavity. In fact, the fossil in which we originally believed that they would have had an inflatable structure was an Ankylosaurus, where it would have had a pretty much it had a concave cavity on its face with wrinkled skin over it. So that is where the original theory came from. So it's more reasonably to put it on a hadrosaur like this. And generally, if they didn't want to put it on one of those creatures and they wanted to use something from the Dino Dex activity guide, which they like to use a lot of creatures from, they could have went with Rhinorex. Even though there's no direct evidence of it having an inflatable structure, at least it has an empty nasal cavity where they could have included one. Generally, Tsintaosaurus gets half a star. It really doesn't look much like any hadrosaur, let alone Tsintaosaurus. It's really poorly made and generally kind of looks like some sort of hadrosaur from the Jurassic franchise. Moving on to the next one, which is Velociraptor. So generally looking at the head may be a little bit too thick, especially compared to Velociraptor fossils, though the beef here that may be giving benefit of the doubt. Velociraptor, if you put all the flesh onto it, it may be a little bit thicker, though I still think the head is still a bit too thick, especially near the end of the snap. Now, another issue is that it has its wrist pronated downwards, which if you didn't know, dinosaurs actually had their palms facing each other and were not able to curl them downwards, which honestly they would have to break their wrist to be able to do that. So that's why this is a very inaccurate Velociraptor hand placement. Moving on, the actual general body shape looks pretty solid. I think it is a little bit too beefy in certain areas, especially in the neck, right near the head. But otherwise, I think the general body shape is pretty solid. Moving on, it's missing the tail fan and the wing feathers. So it does actually have wing feathers, but they are very small and kind of just cover around the elbow, and they should go around the entire, from basically the top of the arm all the way down, covering the first finger. Generally, that is one big issue with that. And then the tail fan is completely missing with it having just a fluffy tail, where it should have a tail fan. Another thing is Velociraptor has completely wrong type of feathers. It has more filamentous feathers, while in reality it should have more complete carnaceous feathers, covering the entire body. Another weird thing is that Velociraptor is shown living in groups, though it is thankfully said that Velociraptor did not hunt in packs, though it is just happens to be in groups very often in the show for no reason, and they never give an explanation for this. But again, at least they do have an entire episode disputing the claim that Velociraptor was a pack hunter. And, well, yeah, it was not. Though in another episode it is shown that Velociraptor is kind of a symbiotic animal, which doesn't make much sense. It's shown to have somewhat of a symbiotic relationship with the Dreadnoughtus, where it would clean off, well, Meganeura from its back, which there's a few issues with this, which Dreadnoughtus first thing never lived with Velociraptor, though I think this Dreadnoughtus is just supposed to be a stand-in for a sauropod in general, so I can let that slide, though to be fair, I believe that there is some fragmentary remains of some sort of sauropod from the formation Velociraptor's from, though we don't actually, it's not described, though I could be wrong about that. But generally, Velociraptor has more traits of being an actual predator instead of being, well, something that would have just picked insects off of an animal. And it may have eaten insects every once in a while, but it probably would not have been able to make up its whole diet since, well, Meganeura lived many millions of years before Velociraptor, and went extinct so long before even the dinosaurs came around. Before Dimetrodon, in fact. Well, around the same time as Dimetrodon, close to when they went extinct. So Meganeura definitely did not live with Velociraptor alongside any other large insects. Generally, Velociraptor I think is a solid pick for the series, but I think the only reason it was really put in is because they wanted a small feathered theropod, and they probably wanted Sinosauropteryx in particular, but instead they decided to go with Velociraptor since it's been overdue to be in the series, and also just because it's a more popular species. Which I'm not saying Sinosauropteryx would have been a better pick per se, just most of the inaccuracies would not be an issue. Generally, the head shape looks closer to Sinosauropteryx, being a little bit more bulky, though it is still more Velociraptor shaped. But the long, poofy, striped tail is a trait of Sinosauropteryx, alongside many others. So yeah, that's why I really think it should have been Sinosauropteryx, and I believe they probably wanted to go with Sinosauropteryx, just replace it with Velociraptor. Velociraptor, I give a solid 5 stars. It has all the parts there, just they're not applied correctly. Now we move on to our next dinosaur, Megaraptor. First thing I'm going to start off with is Megaraptor and other Megaraptors are from really kind of fragmentary remains, and generally their placement is kind of iffy. But, so a lot of things we know from each Megaraptor are known from each other. So, yeah, that's kind of just to say that Megaraptor is somewhat fragmentary, so some issues may not be actual issues, but we'll get into that more. So, from the speculative kind of skeleton based off of other Megaraptors that it's related to, generally the Megaraptor's body shape looks pretty solid. The proportions also look great, especially in the tail, body, and legs. I do have to say that the arms are kind of in a halfway pronated hand placement, so it's kind of weird. Also, I think the arms are a little bit too scrawny, and again, the hands might be a little bit too small, though that may just be in my opinion. I think it may also be just because compared to the head, which is a bit oversized, but we'll get to that, it also just looks much smaller than it should be. Moving on to that head, generally, again, we don't actually have a skull for Megaraptor, but based off of this reconstructed skull, based off of its relatives, it should be a bit thinner. Though at the same time, again, we don't actually have a skull for Megaraptor, so this could work, but generally, there's no way to know as of now. Another issue is that the eye is way too big and way too cartoony, while in reality it should be a little bit smaller. Generally, also the neck is too thick, though that is really just to compensate for the large head. Megaraptor having feathers, it doesn't have the full body feathered, but it has a good amount of feathers along the top of its back, and that is pretty reasonable, especially for the placement that Megaraptor and other Megaraptorids are in. So yeah, I think the feathers are actually pretty reasonable. One issue is that the Megaraptor's tongue is so long that it's able to stick it out of its mouth. But now we know that most dinosaurs, well, these theropods, would not be able to really had pretty much immobile tongues, kind of similar to alligators, but they wouldn't be able to really move them or really stick them out of their mouth at all. Now moving on to the Megaraptor swimming, I mean, I suppose it's not impossible with it kicking its leg and moving its arms throughout the water, kind of like a bird. So I think it's pretty reasonable, but at the same time, I wouldn't really know, since I don't think there are really any studies on Megaraptor swimming. Now, its diet is pretty interesting, since it's shown to go after pretty much anything, going after juvenile Sarcosuchus, Ankylosaurus, Dreadnoughtus, and Triceratops. Though, I do have to say, the Sarcosuchus, again, was a juvenile, so that was pretty reasonable. Going after Ankylosaurus, like, it's probably because it is a wounded animal that is a bit smaller than it. When it was going after the Dreadnoughtus, it did change its mind after the Dreadnoughtus was able to scare it off. And the Triceratops, it wasn't actively going after an adult Triceratops, it was trying to go after the juvenile Triceratops and the Triceratops' eggs. So I say its diet's relatively reasonable, it just ends up in some questionable situations. Generally, the Dino Dex Megaraptor, I'd say, gets about 7 stars. It's a pretty solid animal. It has its issues, but besides that, I think it is pretty solid Megaraptor design. Now we move on to the Tyrant Lizard King itself, Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, looking at the general body shape, the Tyrannosaurus Rex looks pretty much perfect. It looks bulky enough, it looks generally the right proportions, and yeah, pretty much perfect. One thing that you do see a lot of times is that it has pronated wrist in some scenes, but throughout the show, at least the episodes that are out as of now, it mostly had its hands facing each other, which is correct. So most of the time it's correct, though at some times it does get pronated wrist. Another issue is that this is kind of more of a universal issue for theropods and dinosaurs in general in the show, is that they're able to smile and just generally snarl and move their lips around, which, well, dinosaurs would not be able to do. They did not have lips like mammals that are very mobile. They would have had lips close to the reptiles, where they pretty much were not really movable at all, and generally were just there to cover up the teeth. Now onto the skin. I believe they did get the skin wrong, since T-Rex had many small scales across most of the body, and they probably would have made it look leathery. While in the show, it doesn't, even in the close-up scenes, it doesn't really seem to have scales. It just seems to kind of just have skin. So I believe that is another thing that they did get incorrect about the Tyrannosaurus. Now we're going to move on to probably the biggest issue with the T-Rex's design-wise, is the feathers. Again, we don't have skin impressions from the entire T-Rex, but from most of the T-Rex, we have at least some patches of skin impressions, and also based off some of T-Rex's relatives. Generally, we can tell that it did not have feathers, at least definitely not to this extent. They probably either completely lacked feathers or had very small amount of fuzz on some parts of their bodies, probably mainly just being left over. And they may have had feathers when they were young, though. It's likely that they probably had them when they were young, but by the time they were adults, they did not need them to keep them warm, and they would overheat by having feathers. Its swimming seems reasonable enough, since it mainly uses its hind legs to really kick itself and move throughout the water. While on the other hand, keeping its head above the water like a tiger, I guess, is not impossible. I mean, I don't think there's really any evidence in particular saying that T-Rex didn't like getting water in its face, though at the same time I could see it being reasonable enough. Another inaccurate thing is T-Rex was able to jump at least like 7 feet in the air into the pool, which is impossible since T-Rex probably was not able to jump, especially not to this extent. And another issue, again, the tongue being way too flexible and mobile. And I think a thing that it does is it licks its lips and teeth, which I believe the Megaraptor might have also done, which I don't know about you, but I feel like it would really cut up its tongue since it had very serrated teeth. Another issue is that the T-Rex is able to roar, which actually pretty much all the dinosaurs in the show roar. While in reality, dinosaurs like T-Rex and probably all of them were not incapable of roaring, and probably in particular T-Rex would have made low bellowing sounds, which it was able to do with its mouth closed. Some other behaviors that are questionable is pack hunting, which is not impossible. If you're going to go for a group of dinosaurs that is a pack hunter, T-Rex is probably one of your best bets. While on the other hand, hunting Dreadnoughtus is pretty much completely unreasonable, since, T-Rex didn't really live with any sauropods, with the exception of Ankylosaurus, and even then, Ankylosaurus would have been a very rare sight for T-Rex. And it was probably incapable of hunting such a large animal, only being able to go after the young and maybe the old and sick. Otherwise, again, I think they really should have included some sort of Carcharodontosaurus like Giganotosaurus or Mapusaurus, since Mapusaurus is mentioned in the show and Giganotosaurus is also was in the previous series. And generally, those guys did go after sauropods as opposed to T-Rex. One thing I did kind of forget to mention is that Giganotosaurus, Mapusaurus, and Spinosaurus are mentioned to be larger than T-Rex, when in reality T-Rex was much larger than all of them. So, yeah, that is something that's wrong, though. That's more of an issue with the other guys instead of T-Rex. Generally, the T-Rex design-wise, it's almost perfect. I would probably give it a 9 stars design-wise, with the feathers really being the only issue. But the behaviors do bring it down quite a bit. So that's why I have to give it a 7.5 stars. Pretty solid T-Rex, best in this franchise. Though, generally, if it just had acted a little bit more like a T-Rex and also didn't have the feathers, it would have been perfect. Now we move on to the last creature, and this possibly is literally the worst in the franchise, and that's being Triceratops. First off, I don't even know where to start with this abomination. Generally the head, you can see, is much larger than the actual animal, where it should be shrunken down quite a bit, and honestly, the head isn't even horrible, at least size-wise. I think the horns, again, we also don't know what extent they would have grown to, since they would have been covered in keratin. But, the frill is also way too big, like 2 or 3 times larger than the actual Triceratops' frill, which is insane. Why would they do this to the animal? By far, this is the most ridiculous, out there, and unreasonable design for Triceratops in the franchise, even outdoing the Dino Dan Triceratops in. If you've seen it, you know how bad that one is. Also, the general body shape is okay. The general body shape is actually probably the best part of this model, with the tail possibly being a little bit too long and also being a little bit too low to the ground. But besides that, the general body shape is pretty solid. Again, moving on to the face, again, the frill is way too big, and generally the whole entire face is compressed, almost similar to another Ceratopsian Pentaceratops. Even then, for a Pentaceratops, it would be too compressed. Another thing, the horn shape does look a little bit off, especially based off the bone core of Triceratops, alongside the nasal horn being a bit too big, though again, maybe Triceratops' nasal horn was able to grow a little bit larger than we expected. Another thing is the spine, pretty much the horns on the edge of the frill. It's kind of debated if adult Triceratops would have had those or if they would have smoothed out by adulthood. Though from what I hear, mostly they probably would have smoothed out by adulthood or at least decreased some. So they are a little bit too big, especially as an adult Triceratops. Now the skin. Generally in the show, it's shown with smooth skin with some sort of, either its spine exposed at the back or with some sort of osteoderm down the back, which is pretty much completely unreasonable for Triceratops. Triceratops would have had a bunch of smaller scales, with every once in a while having an extremely large one with that had a raised center, which may have also been the base for a quill. So Triceratops may have had quills, though that would have been more speculative, and it's okay if they did not include it onto the actual Triceratops model. But its skin being completely wrong on this model. Now we move on to the feet, which it just gives it like straight up elephant feet, while in reality Triceratops and other ceratopsians on the front limbs would have had 3 fingers, and alongside 2 vestigial ones, and the hind feet would have had 4 toes, with, of course, again, not all the toes touching the ground perfectly. Now, generally, the Triceratops' size looks a little bit undersized. I think Triceratops should be a bit bigger, at least based off this image with it next to Kayla. Though this is a little bit more questionable. It might just be a smaller individual. It kind of seems as if they kind of shrunk the whole body down and the head is closer in size. It's really just confusing. The Dino Dex Triceratops proportion-wise is just really weird, and generally I think it may be a little bit too small. Now, its social behavior, again, Triceratops was thought to be mostly a solitary animal, with it maybe getting in large groups every once in a while, maybe during mating season. Well, in the show, it's shown to live in a large family group, so yeah, that's a bit questionable. And, yeah, you thought that was the end for the Triceratops, but no, there's also the baby Triceratops. But instead of being an actual baby Triceratops, it's just lazily a shrunken down version of the adult, which is definitely one of the worst things to do for a dinosaur, especially Triceratops. But based off how the size of it, I would say that it's an older juvenile, or like middle-aged juvenile, so it's too small to be an infant or a baby Triceratops. So, yeah, especially with this image compared to Dex and Kayla, it seems a little bit too big to be that. So I'd say it's about this stage in its life. Basing off that, generally the horn should be curved backwards. The frill should be much smaller, even smaller than an adult in proportion to the rest of the body. And then generally, anything else is pretty much had the same exact issues as the adult Triceratops. Otherwise, yeah, the baby Triceratops is even worse than the adult in my opinion. So yeah, that gives Triceratops 1.5 stars, just barely better than that Tsintaosaurus. Generally, the reason why I got this high is at least the body is at least decent, I guess. So yeah, those are all the ones that we've seen so far. There are at least 3 other species appear in season 1, but those episodes have not released yet. I will do an update when those species, when those seasons release and we get to see those species. And the mainly reason why I'm not going to be doing it now is because the images we have are not even like a full body. Another reason why is because, well, again, we don't even know what these technically are since we have none of them confirmed. I'm assuming the rhino is an Elasmotherium, and the marine reptile, I'm assuming, is a Tyrannosaurus based off the traits it has. But the carnivorous mammal is almost impossible to tell right now. There's many theories on what it is, but again, we'll have no idea until the series actually releases. So yeah, that is my Dino Dex accuracy review. Generally, the show, honestly, has potential. It has potential pretty much to be one of the most accurate dinosaur shows of all time, but instead they decide to do some ridiculous things. I know the show is supposed to be about speculation, but some of these things are not speculation and just made up things with literally no evidence put on species that they don't belong. So yeah, generally Dino Dex does not have the best dinosaur designs, especially compared to the other series. We're really going forward, with each series having more and more accurate designs. With this series having some designs that are much more accurate than the previous series, but then a lot of other ones that are going backwards with their accuracy. Generally, I hope Dino Dex improves in later seasons. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If I forgot anything, comment down below, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.